Hello, this is the activist tool protest, or more appropriately, nonviolent action. I want to talk to you a little bit about what nonviolent action is and why that's the preferred tool of activists. Obviously, we all kind of vaguely know what a protest is, but here I'm going to talk more about what motivates protest, the ethics behind it, and then also the strategies for it, why activists use it, and what makes it so important. I'm going to start off with a few quotes from some people that you may know. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leader. Many of you would know the I Have a Dream speech, assassinated in 1968. He said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is no such thing as being too late. We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation." I'd love you to think about, even though obviously that's a quote from a long time ago, how true that could still be for us today. Cesar Chavez, who's leader of United Farm Workers, along with Dolores Huerta, said, "We are convinced that nonviolence is more powerful than violence. We are convinced that nonviolence supports you if you have a just moral cause. If you use violence, you have to sell part of yourself for that violence. Then you are no longer a master of your own struggle." And perhaps the best known in relationship to nonviolence, Mohandas Gandhi, who was probably best known for his work in Indian independence, but who also began as an activist in South Africa, actually, said, "Non-cooperation with evil is as much a duty as is cooperation with good." And one of the misconceptions about nonviolence is that it's passive or weak. Nonviolence is actually very confrontational. It's very direct. It's very political. But it's really a way of confronting a system of violent oppression with something fundamentally different from what they're doing. And I found a great book through the University of Maryland's research website, and I really encourage you to familiarize yourself with Front Range's EBSCO, especially as you do research for your YouTube video or for any of your other projects. So this book is by Mark Matani. It's called Strategic Nonviolent Power, and he identifies a bunch of characteristics of nonviolence. The first is that nonviolent resistance is not passive, nor is it weak. Rather, such action is an exercise of power. And he goes on to say that it derives from satya, or truth. You insist on the truth. Gandhi called it a truth force. Martin Luther King called it a soul force. The idea is that that moral high ground will provide you with that strength. So there is an element of faith in this. And I don't think that means that you have to have religious faith. I think it could also be conceptualized as faith in humanity. But I do think you have to have some kind of faith to believe that nonviolence works. Two, there are times when negotiation and mediation are effective approaches for resolving conflicts, but basic human rights cannot be negotiated away. History offers few, if any, cases where individuals or groups perpetuating structural violence of human rights have been willing to give up significant power and privilege without struggle. Effective resistance requires challenging that power and privilege with opposing force. Okay, and again, opposing force doesn't mean violence necessarily, but it does mean strong opposition. Okay. 3, nonviolent resistance is not necessarily safe, and we'll see this in one of our examples. The exercise of nonviolent options generally results in fewer casualties than do violent alternatives, but nonviolent campaigns that face serious oppression do experience casualties, and it requires substantial and continuous courage, as he said. And the more oppressive the regime, the more likely it is that nonviolent resistance will encounter some form of violence in that struggle. 4, the many forms of nonviolent action range from relatively modest persuasive efforts to major disruptions of the social fabric. Because nonviolent struggle is complex, substantial humility is required in trying to capture its power coherently and comprehensively. Yet that effort is critically important. And while some nonviolent, so 5. Some nonviolent movements have emerged from deeply spiritual stances or other passionately principled positions, but most nonviolent campaigns and most participants in such campaigns have not acted primarily out of convictions. Instead, nonviolent action is usually chosen because there's not a viable military option. So the types of people that you might associate with nonviolent resistance, if you look at the African Americans in the South in the Civil Rights Movement, who had an incredible police force, National Guard, structures of violence pulled out against them. Military options are not a viable form of resistance. 6, effective nonviolent action is difficult, if not impossible, to sustain when driven by hatred. Although many participants initially engage with a movement out of anger, it appears that in most successful cases, nonviolent struggle confronts oppression aggressively, while maintaining respect for all parties as human beings. And Gandhi says that men comprising the governments are not to be regarded as enemies. To regard them as such would be contrary to the nonviolent spirit. Part we must, but as friends. And then he goes on to quote somebody else, and saying that, and insists that neither hatred nor anger can provide direction for what is to be built. And structural oppression is always maintained not by a single individual, but by an entire system. So, being angry at one police officer or one construction worker who's cutting down a tree is really misplaced. There are really extensive power structures at play, and if we can approach those individuals, challenging them, but also on the other hand, not from a place of anger, then we will be most powerful. Now, the questions that, and so let me give you an example, okay, because I think it's hard to think about how that might actually work in practice. One of the best examples I can think of is the Chipko movement. And they were the original tree huggers, okay? Chipko literally means embrace. And it was a group of women who, in rural India, who depended on the forest as their primary source of food. Whether it was collecting firewood, collecting plants, or forage for their animals, this is where food comes from for this village. So there's not a market economy where you go to the store and buy things. People are subsistence farmers, right? And they began to face in the 1960s a set of government policies that was focused on economic development, and I'm using air quotes, because it was economic development through deforesting these lands so the government could get cash, but at the expense of people's food supply. And some of the results of the deforestation were incredible floods, erosion, degrading water quality, and it really was completely destructive for their lives. And so in 1973, villagers in this remote town in the Himalayas in Uttar Pradesh got wind of deforestation that was about to happen and literally surrounded the trees. Chipko means embrace, so they're tree huggers, right? Surrounded the trees and said to the people who were there to cut the trees down, if you want to kill these trees, you have to kill us too. And the men threatened them with guns, threatened to mow them down, and eventually didn't do it. So the women were successful, and by 1980, they were successful in in building a movement and getting a 15-year ban on tree felling in their region. So one example of where nonviolent resistance can be really, really effective, right? It's not necessarily passive. It does involve risk, but when you're a group of rural village women who depend on the forest for food, going up against these powerful forces, government forces, this is your best mode of activism in a lot of ways. And one of the things that often students say to me that they feel so powerless about is environmental destruction. Like, how do you protest destruction of the environment? How do we deal with all of these things that seem to be happening to us? And there's another answer also, another example from Kenya, in the Greenbelt movement. The Greenbelt movement was founded by Wangari Maathai, who was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. And she saw deforestation in Kenya in the 1970s. It was a really similar reason. The government had encouraged deforestation so that they could make space for cash crops, like sugar and tea, for export. And this was supposed to be a strategy of economic development that was going to benefit people. It benefited men's earnings, but women who were subsistence farmers doing the majority of the food production for their families really struggled. The quality of food went down, the distance they had to walk for firewood went down, the availability of water went down. I don't know if you know this, but trees actually secure the water supply, and when you cut down the trees, you can create a desert, and that is what had started happening in Kenya. So in 1977, just distraught by all of these things, Wangari Maathai founded the Greenbelt movement, and what they did was empower women to begin to change their environments themselves. And she started a nursery of trees, sent them out to villages around Kenya, and paid women a small amount of money for every tree still alive in the end. And now that, and once women saw what the trees could do, once they saw water return, once they saw firewood being available, once they saw, all the benefits for the animals that they kept, women became committed themselves to this movement. And I encourage you to check it out further, the greenbeltmovement.org. There's also a couple of other really fun resources that you can check out after the lecture's over. But I want to leave you with a couple of questions about nonviolent resistance that's going to be on your discussion board. One of the things that is in this theory is this idea of kind of faith, whether you want it to be in a higher power or faith in humanity, as I've suggested. So the question is, do all people share a fundamental set of moral values? It's not clear to me that they do, but I think that engaging in nonviolent resistance kind of presumes that at a certain level you have that truth power, that soul force, and that people will come around and recognize that when you have the truth on your side. The second question is, can nonviolent resistance really confront and replace violent oppression effectively? Right, the cutting down of trees and the threatening of women at gunpoint to cut down these trees, and I think in this case it did, but it doesn't always necessarily. But also not to be too celebratory, I also want to think about how government and other authority figures seek to limit nonviolent resistance. Anyone who's ever tried to plan a protest, at least in New York City, has had to file their plans with the Parks Department and negotiate with the police and change their plans 100 times and all kinds of things. So there's ways that the government seeks to limit resistance and manage protest and disruption. So think about those things, and I will see you on the discussion boards for more.